Who authorized a grease monkey to step onto the flight command floor? The question cut through the pressurized air of the glass-walled hangar suite like a bird striking a turbine. A few senior flight directors snickered into their coffee cups. This is an elite pre-flight briefing, not a mid-flight oil leak change. Somebody get this mechanic back down to the tarmac where he belongs. The single father didn't flinch. He just stood there, his grease-stained hands steady at his sides, his eyes calmly scanning the multi-layered telemetry screens like he understood the complex aerodynamic algorithms better than the engineers who had spent 5 years coding them. In just a few minutes, that entire room of high-flying executives would fall completely silent because of him. Because this wasn't about a man in scuffed work boots stepping out of bounds. It was about an invisible authority that none of them were equipped to recognize. "Relax," the man in the faded denim coveralls said quietly. His voice carried a deep, grounded resonance that immediately anchored the room, a stark contrast to the high-pitched panic starting to brew in the flight data feeds. "I'll clear out in a second. I just noticed a catastrophic calibration drift on your primary pitch axis feeds that you might want to look at before the boarding doors lock." No one fired back immediately. It wasn't because they respected the mechanic, but because his delivery lacked even a hint of hesitation. It wasn't defensive, and it certainly wasn't nervous. It was entirely absolute. Garrett Stone stood at the threshold of the command deck, a simple hydraulic pressure wrench hanging loosely from his right hand. The bright morning sun reflecting off the silver fuselage of the flagship private jet outside framed his silhouette, casting a long shadow across the polished epoxy floor. To anyone passing by, he looked like a low-level service technician who had taken a wrong turn on his way to the fuel bays. But his eyes told a completely different story. They tracked the sweeping digital flight paths, atmospheric density curves, and real-time sensor matrices with an eerie, practiced familiarity. The aviation director, Julian Blake, leaned forward over the glass conference table, his tailored suit shifting as his face darkened with intense irritation. He was a man who demanded absolute perfection and total obedience from his flight crews, and he despised interruptions, especially from a man who smelled of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid. "You noticed a calibration drift?" Julian repeated, his voice heavy with mocking disbelief. "I assure you, my flight safety department consists of MIT graduates and veteran aerospace engineers who monitor these automated systems around the clock. We don't need a line mechanic diagnosing our flagship avionics." A few of the board members smiled smugly. Sit down beside Julian, the majority shareholder and CEO of the global charter empire, Victoria Sterling, didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss him either. She simply sat perfectly still, her piercing emerald eyes fixed intensely on Garrett's face, evaluating his unbothered posture. Garrett didn't take a step back. He didn't shrink under their collective glare. "Your automated systems are auto-balancing for standard sea-level density," he explained calmly, pointing a calloused finger toward the upper left telemetry array. "But you're routing this transatlantic flight through a severe high-altitude thermal pocket over the northern corridor. The sensor lag is already compounding. It's small right now, but give it 15 minutes after takeoff, and the autopilot is going to misinterpret the pressure drop as a structural stall. It will force a hard pitch down to compensate." A heavy silence dropped over the room. It wasn't comfortable, and it certainly wasn't accepting, but it was thick enough to make the air feel heavy. Julian let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "That's statistically impossible. The Horizon 9 software array dynamically filters atmospheric anomalies. It has been stress-tested across 10,000 simulated flight hours. Not for this specific payload configuration, and not with a pre-existing thermal variance," Garrett replied, his voice remaining flat, steady, and entirely unbothered. "You've got overlapping navigation updates feeding into the same sensor choke point. Look at the pitch axis feedback loop. It's staggering." Julian frowned, his fingers suddenly flying across his high-end tablet to pull up the core system layers. "That is completely ridiculous. Security, get this man off my deck." "Wait." Victoria's voice sliced through the argument, cool, controlled, and instantly halting the entire room. She leaned forward, her elegant hands clasping together on the table as her sharp gaze narrowed at the specific screen Garrett had pointed out. "Which exact sensor pocket did you just mention?" Garrett stepped forward just one single pace, pointing directly at the flashing green telemetry stream. "Right there. The secondary pedostatic system shouldn't be converging with the primary data bus while the aircraft is climbing through 24,000 feet. Your predictive model is misreading the localized air density." Julian's face went pale as he stared at his tablet. The green line on the main display suddenly shifted. a tiny flicker of amber appearing at the very edge of the flight path map. It was a minute fluctuation, the kind of micro-error that standard protocols would completely ignore. But Julian knew the mathematics. And the way his hands froze over the screen told everyone in that room that the mechanic had just found something they had all completely missed. Victoria noticed her director's hesitation instantly. Her expression didn't soften, but her eyes darkened with an intense, calculated focus. She looked away from the monitor and looked directly at Garrett, seeing past the grease and the uniform for the first time. How long until that amber warning turns into an absolute system lockout? Victoria asked, her voice dropping into a demanding, quiet tone. Garrett looked up at the digital clock ticking down to the VIP flight's departure. You have exactly 12 minutes before the flight computer seals the telemetry log, he said. Once that aircraft leaves the tarmac, you won't be able to override it from the ground. It will cascade. Julian Blake forced a sharp, rattling breath through his teeth, his fingers tightening so hard against his tablet that the plastic frame creaked. This is a baseline data anomaly, Victoria. It happens during every pre-flight diagnostic cycle. We don't ground a $50 million charter asset because a man who sweeps up metal shavings thinks he can read telemetry. If we delay this takeoff, we miss our slot at Heathrow, and the Vanguard Group logistics contract goes up in smoke. Victoria Sterling didn't move. She didn't look at Julian. Her eyes remained anchored to Garrett Stone, tracking the absolute stillness in the mechanic's posture. She had spent 15 years navigating the cutthroat waters of global aviation finance, breaking men far more powerful than the director sitting beside her. She knew exactly what fear looked like. She knew how executives blustered when their authority was threatened. But the man standing in front of her in the grease-stained coveralls wasn't blustering. He wasn't trying to sell her anything. He wasn't even asking for her validation. If you upload that ground terminal patch right now, Garrett said, his voice dropping into a low, even cadence that cut right through Julian's escalating panic, you'll force a data overwrite while the air cycle machine is actively pressurizing. You won't fix the drift. You'll just blind the flight computer to the fact that it's happening. Julian stood up so fast, his leather chair rolled back and struck the glass partition. You don't know what you're talking about. Who do you think you are? You're a third-shift line technician. You don't have the clearance to even view the architecture of that operating system, let alone lecture my department on data overrides. I've spent 10,000 hours watching these specific airframes breathe, Julian, Garrett replied quietly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point his wrench. He just stood his ground like an oak tree in a thunderstorm. Systems don't lie. People do, usually to protect their timelines. But the metal doesn't care about your Heathrow slot. Victoria's jaw tightened. A cold, dangerous suspicion began to take root in her mind. She leaned back, her emerald eyes narrowing to sharp slits. Julian, run the manual isolation test on the secondary pedo bus. Right now. Julian hesitated, his skin turning a pasty shade of gray. Victoria, that test takes 8 minutes. We don't have... Run it, she commanded. The single word was quiet, but it carried the weight of an executioner's axe. Before Julian's trembling fingers could hit the terminal screen, the heavy, frosted glass doors of the command deck flew open. A panicked woman in a pristine nanny uniform stepped into the room, her hands frantically gripping the shoulders of a small, trembling 7-year-old boy. Madam Sterling, I am so sorry, the nanny stammered, her voice shaking violently. I couldn't keep him in the executive lounge. He started hyperventilating the moment the auxiliary power unit kicked on outside. He won't breathe. Victoria's terrifying, frozen corporate mask shattered into 1,000 pieces in an instant. She tore herself away from the conference table, her high heels clicking frantically against the floor as she dropped to her knees in front of her son, Pierce. The boy's face was completely pale, his chest heaving in short, terrifying gasps as he clawed at his collar, his eyes wide with absolute, blind terror. Pierce, look at Mommy, Victoria pleaded, her voice suddenly losing all of its iron, cracking with a helpless, desperate panic that none of her employees had ever heard before. Pierce, sweetie, you're okay. It's just the airplanes. You're safe. Take a breath for Mommy. Please, baby, breathe. But the boy couldn't hear her. The overwhelming, low-frequency hum of the massive jet engines outside the hangar windows had triggered an absolute sensory lockdown. He twisted away from her touch, crying out in a choked, strangled sob, his small frame trembling so violently he could barely keep his balance. Victoria reached for him, her hands shaking, her wealth, her power, and her billion-dollar empire completely useless against the raw terror consuming her child. She looked around the room, her eyes wide and pleading, but her executive team just froze, stepping back, completely paralyzed by the sudden vulnerability of their ruthless leader. Then a heavy, solid shadow fell over them. Garrett Stone set his hydraulic wrench down on the edge of the glass table with a quiet, deliberate click. He didn't hesitate. He knelt down right beside Victoria, his large, calloused hand gently coming to rest on the boy's trembling shoulder. He didn't push, he didn't pull. He just brought an immense, unshakable wall of calm into the center of the panic. "Hey there, pilot," Garrett said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was incredibly warm, grounded, and steady. The voice of a father who had navigated the darkest nights without losing his balance. "That's a heavy engine vibration, isn't it? Feels like the whole world is shaking." Little Pierce stopped flailing, his tear-filled eyes snapping toward Garrett's face, caught completely off guard by the total lack of fear in the man's expression. Garrett gave the boy a small, reassuring nod, his thumb gently rubbing a rhythmic, soothing circle against the shoulder of Pierce's jacket. "That's just the horizon, 9 clearing its throat," Garrett whispered softly, maintaining direct, calm eye contact. "It's a big, loud machine, but it only shakes because it's waiting for a smart pilot to tell it where to go." "Do you want to know a secret about that sound?" The boy's chest slowed its frantic heaving just a fraction, a ragged breath escaping his lips as he nodded faintly. Victoria watched in absolute, breathless silence, her hands trembling against her knees as she witnessed a man in greasy work boots do in 30 seconds what her money and her elite doctors couldn't achieve in years. She could see the profound, natural strength radiating from him, an emotional security so deep it made the entire room feel safe. "Every time that engine hums like that," Garrett said softly, pointing out toward the silver jet through the glass, "it's actually counting backward from 5. It's waiting for you to match its rhythm so it can settle down. Let's count it out together. 5, 4. Pierce let out a long, shuddering exhale, his tiny voice joining Garrett's steady baritone. 3, 2. The boy's head sank forward against Garrett's denim shoulder, his breathing instantly dropping into a synchronized, peaceful rhythm. Garrett held him lightly, his large arm acting as a protective shield against the world, his quiet masculinity filling the space with an undeniable sense of absolute protection. Victoria looked up from her son's face, her eyes locking onto Garrett's profile. The suspicion that had been brewing in her chest suddenly hardened into a terrifying certainty. This man wasn't just a mechanic. No ordinary line worker possessed this level of absolute command over both advanced aerodynamics and human chaos. Before she could speak, the primary telemetry monitor behind them let out a sharp, piercing alarm, the amber line suddenly flashing a deep, violent crimson. The crimson light from the master telemetry wall bathed the entire glass briefing room in a sinister, blood-red glow. The steady, hypnotic hum of the aircraft outside was suddenly replaced by a harsh, rhythmic audio alert, echoing from the ceiling speakers. "System lockout imminent," the digital voice droned. "Pitch axis divergence exceeds safety parameters." Julian Blake dropped his tablet onto the table, his face draining of whatever color he had left. "It's a ghost in the machine," he yelled, his voice cracking as he spun around to face the terminal. The manual isolation test triggered a data loop because this line tech interrupted the sequence. He's corrupted the pre-flight log. He shoved past a senior flight director, snatching up the hardwired desk microphone to connect directly to the ground crew on the tarmac. "Fuel Bay 3, force initialize the secondary data patch. Clear the cabin doors for immediate engine start. Bypass the terminal check." "Stop the initialization, Julian," Garrett said. He hadn't stood up yet. He remained on one knee, his large frame still providing a protective shield for little Pierce, who was now quietly breathing against his shoulder, completely immune to the flashing red lights because of the solid warmth of the man holding him. "If you force that data patch while the pressure valves are locked, you're going to blow the seals on the secondary actuator lines. There are 4 ground handlers standing directly under that wing right now." Julian tore the microphone away from his mouth, his glare locking onto Garrett with pure venom. "Shut up. Just shut your mouth. You have sabotaged my flight deck, you have terrified the CEO's son with your ridiculous stories, and you are trying to cost this company its most valuable contract, security. I want this man in handcuffs before the aircraft taxi cycle begins." 2 burly airport security officers in black tactical vests stepped through the glass doors, their boots heavy against the floor. They looked at Julian, then at Victoria, waiting for the final nod to move in. Victoria didn't give it. She stood completely frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her eyes moved from Julian's sweating, panicked face to Garrett's perfectly calm, steady gaze. The contrast was devastating. Her director of aviation, a man she paid $500,000 a year to manage her fleet, was unraveling into a screaming child. The mechanic, who earned an hourly wage to clean up oil spills, was the only thing keeping the room from spinning out of control. Pierce tightened his small fingers around the lapel of Garrett's denim coveralls. "Mommy, no," the boy whispered, his voice small but perfectly clear through the blaring alarms. "Don't let them take him." He fixed the loud noise. He made it stay at 4. Victoria swallowed the lump of raw panic in her throat. Her protective motherly instinct slammed into her fierce corporate conditioning. "Step back," she ordered the security guards. Her voice was ice. Julian gasped. "Victoria, we have 5 minutes before we lose the entire European delivery window. He is a line mechanic. He is guessing." "He's not guessing," Victoria said, her emerald eyes fixed on the way Garrett's hand hadn't shaken once, even with 2 armed guards hovering over him. She looked at Julian, her cold corporate authority returning like a weapon. "Daniel, execute a manual override on the tarmac fuel lines. Freeze the departure." Daniel Reyes, the chief operating officer who had been quietly watching from the back corner, didn't move. He looked down at his own screen, his jaw dropping. "Victoria, the fuel pressure in the starboard wing just spiked by 300%. The automated system isn't filtering it, it's forcing it." The air in the room turned completely stagnant. Outside the massive glass windows, the 4 ground handlers beneath the flagship jet suddenly jumped back as a high-pitched whistling sound began to screech from the undercarriage of the aircraft. They didn't know what was happening. They were trapped in the dead zone beneath the main fuel tanks. Julian froze, the microphone slipping from his numb fingers and clattering onto the desk. He didn't know how to stop it. The software had locked him out. The elite engineering team was 3,000 miles away in a corporate office, and his own systems were turning into a weapon. Garrett gently stood up, lifting Pierce effortlessly with one arm and setting him down safely in Victoria's waiting arms. He didn't say a word to Julian. He didn't gloat. He simply stepped past the security guards, his heavy boots making a slow, deliberate sound against the floor as he walked straight to the main command console. He didn't use the keyboard. Instead, he reached down to the underneath of the primary terminal housing, his thick fingers tracing the seam of the plastic casing until he found a hidden, recessed metal toggle switch, a feature that wasn't listed on any civilian blueprint of the Horizon 9 system. He flicked it down. "Initiating the Obsidian fallback protocol," Garrett muttered, his voice entirely steady as his fingers danced across a black command line interface that suddenly overrode the glossy corporate software. "Strip the predictive layer. Drop the bus voltage to 12. Let the mechanical valves bleed manually." Julian stared at the terminal screen, his eyes wide with an absolute paralyzing shock that had nothing to do with the failing aircraft. That command line is classified military architecture," he whispered, his voice trembling so hard it was barely audible. "The Obsidian project was cancelled 7 years ago. Only the lead test pilots and the chief design engineers of the Defense Division had the hardware override keys. Who are you?" Garrett didn't look back. On the main display, the crimson lines instantly froze. Outside, the terrifying high-pitched whistling under the wing stopped completely, replaced by the soft, safe hiss of excess pressure venting harmlessly into the overflow tanks. The 4 ground handlers outside looked up, wiping sweat from their brows, completely unaware of how close they had just come to disaster. The room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. The alarms had stopped. The red light had faded back into a neutral amber. Victoria held her son tightly against her chest, her eyes wide as she stared at the back of the man in the faded coveralls. She had spent years looking for the legendary mind behind the very aviation systems her empire was built upon, the ghost engineer who had vanished from the military sector after a highly classified incident. Garrett slowly turned around, his face completely expressionless as he picked up his hydraulic wrench from the table. "The system is safe to discharge now," he said quietly, his voice returning to the simple cadence of a third-shift worker. "But you'll need to wash out the secondary lines before you try to fly. If you'll excuse me, I still have 3 more bays to sweep before my shift ends." He took 2 steps toward the exit before Victoria's voice stopped him in his tracks. "Your name isn't Garrett Stone, is it?" Victoria asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of profound awe and sudden, intense realization. Garrett paused, his hand resting on the heavy glass door, but he didn't turn around to face her. "The name on my badge says Stone, ma'am," Garrett said, his voice entirely neutral. "That's the name that clears the background checks. That's all the airport authority cares about." He didn't wait for her to break down his defense. He opened the heavy glass door and stepped out into the long, echoing concrete corridor that led back down to the maintenance bays. "Mommy, let him go!" Pierce cried out, twisting in Victoria's arms. He didn't want the elegant executive lounge or the nanny. He wanted the steady, unyielding safety of the man who had just pulled him back from the edge of terror. He's the only one who knows how to make the loud noise stop. Victoria held her son tightly, her knuckles turning white against his jacket. She looked up at Julian Blake, her face entirely devoid of the warmth she had just shown her child. Her eyes were green ice. Julian was already sweating through his bespoke dress shirt. He grabbed a linen handkerchief from his pocket, frantically wiping his brow as he looked at the main telemetry board. The crimson warnings had stopped, but the entire grid was locked in a dormant, monochrome state. The system was alive, but it wasn't responding to any of their corporate commands. "This is an absolute farce," Julian stammered, turning to Daniel Reyes. "The Obsidian Protocol is a ghost story from the early defense contracts. That technician probably found a backdoor hack on an old engineering forum. He hasn't fixed anything, he's just held our network hostage to make a point. We have 3 minutes before the airport tower revokes our departure sequence entirely." Daniel looked at his terminal, his hands hovering over the input keys. "Julian, the mechanic said the secondary lines need to be washed out. If there's residual pressure in the actuator..." "I don't care what a janitor with a wrench thinks," Julian snapped, his voice rising to an ugly, high-pitched screech that made little Pierce flinch against Victoria's shoulder. "He's a line worker. We are the directors of this fleet. Force the primary auxiliary power unit back online. Bypass the mechanical valves. If we don't clear this hangar in 2 minutes, the Vanguard Group will pull their entire logistics portfolio by noon." Victoria didn't stop him. Not because she trusted Julian, but because she needed to see exactly how deep the incompetence in her own company ran. She stood up slowly, keeping Pierce shielded behind her, her eyes tracking Julian's frantic, clumsy movements. She was a woman who had built a multi-billion-dollar empire on absolute calculation, yet right now she felt completely hollow. She had all the money in the world, but as she looked at her trembling son, she realized she couldn't buy him a single second of peace. Julian slammed his palm down on the master initialization button. For a single heartbeat, the hangar was completely quiet. Then, a violent, metallic shudder groaned through the entire glass structure of the command deck. Outside on the tarmac, the flagship jet didn't roar to life safely. Instead, a massive, pressurized burst of hydraulic fluid erupted from the starboard wing flap, spraying a thick, toxic mist across the concrete runway. The high-pressure lines hadn't been washed out. The residual force Garrett had warned them about had nowhere to go. The automated valves, forced by Julian's bypass, had violently sheared off their mounts. Instantly, the hangar's master safety system misinterpreted the toxic mist as a Class A fuel fire. A piercing, deafening klaxon began to wail, far louder and more aggressive than the previous aircraft alarms. Heavy, reinforced steel fire doors slammed shut across the entire perimeter of the command suite with a series of massive, explosive thuds, locking them inside. The overhead emergency lights flipped into a blinding, rhythmic strobing pattern. Warning. The automated facility voice boomed through the speakers. High-pressure suppression deployment in 60 seconds. Evacuate the hangar floor immediately. Julian threw himself against the glass partition, looking down at the hangar floor. The main exit gates were locked down by the facility's security matrix. The ground handlers were trapped near the fuel bays, and up in the briefing room, the air terminal controls went completely dead. Julian frantically entered his master administrative code into the wall panel, but the screen just flashed a mocking, cold response. "Access denied. System overridden by facility safety." "We're trapped," Julian whispered, his voice completely breaking as he staggered backward, his hands trembling violently. "The automated foam is going to flood the lower bays. It will choke the engines, destroy the airframes. My career. Everything is gone." He didn't think about the men on the floor. He didn't think about Victoria or her child. He just fell back against the glass table, completely paralyzed by the sudden, brutal reality of his own failure. Victoria felt a cold, sharp spike of absolute terror pierce through her chest. The room was strobing, the alarms were deafening, and her son was screaming, his small hands over his ears as he collapsed into a state of total panic. She looked at her executives, the brilliant minds she had hired to lead her empire, and every single one of them was staring at the locked steel doors with wide, useless eyes. They had all the authority, all the titles, and absolutely no power. Then, the heavy steel emergency door didn't open from the inside terminal. It groaned as something massive buckled the locking mechanism from the outside. With a violent, screeching rip of tearing metal, the heavy deadbolts sheared off completely. The door swung open, and Garrett Stone walked back into the room. He wasn't running. He wasn't sweating. He carried a heavy, industrial pneumatic cutting tool in his right hand, the steel jaws of the machine dripping with hydraulic oil. He looked past the weeping aviation director, past the frozen executives, and looked straight at Victoria. "Grab the boy," Garrett said, his calm, deep voice slicing through the terrifying noise of the sirens like a physical shield. "We're leaving, now." Victoria didn't ask questions. She didn't look back at the polished glass table or the digital displays that had defined her entire world until 5 minutes ago. She scooped Pierce into her arms, burying his face against the crook of her neck, and followed the wide, denim-clad shoulders of the mechanic out into the strobing darkness of the corridor. Behind them, Julian Blake stumbled, his expensive leather loafers slipping on a patch of aerosolized hydraulic fluid that had drifted into the doorway. "Wait! Victoria! You can't leave me here! The system log is completely locked. If the city fire department arrives, the regulatory fines alone will destroy our operating license." He was screaming, his voice echoing off the concrete walls, but it sounded thin, pathetic, and entirely hollow compared to the heavy, rhythmic thud of Garrett's work boots. Garrett didn't slow down. He led them down the winding steel gantry that overlooked the main hangar floor. Below them, the scene was pure, unadulterated chaos. The flagship private jet sat like a wounded silver leviathan under the violent white flashes of the emergency strobe lights. Thick, milky, white fire suppression foam was already beginning to hiss from the massive overhead nozzles, dropping like heavy snow onto the wings. The chemical smell of the retardant, mixed with the sharp, bitter stench of scorched electrical wires, filling the air with a toxic, heavy haze. On the hangar floor, the 4 ground handlers were trapped. The automated security matrix had dropped a heavy, reinforced steel rolling gate across the primary equipment exit, sealing the bay to prevent the spread of a potential fuel fire to the rest of the airport. The men were throwing their shoulders against the metal grid, their faces distorted in panic as the thick foam began to accumulate around their boots, rising rapidly. Daniel Reyes ran to the gantry railing, his face pale as he looked down. "The emergency release valve is on the far wall," he shouted over the deafening roar of the klaxons. "But the automated safety protocols have cut the low-voltage power to the manual switches. We can't lift the gate from up here. Those men are going to be buried in chemical foam within 3 minutes." Victoria felt her throat tighten, a suffocating weight settling over her chest. She looked at her chief operating officer, then at the frantic men below. Her wealth, her pristine reputation, her global logistics empire, none of it could pierce through a line of hard-coded safety logic that had decided 4 human lives were an acceptable sacrifice to protect a piece of real estate. She was entirely, completely helpless. Garrett stopped at the edge of the gantry stairs. He handed the heavy pneumatic cutting tool to Daniel. "Hold this," he commanded, his voice dead calm, utterly devoid of the frantic energy vibrating through the rest of the building. "Stay right here with the boy and Madame Sterling. Do not move past this platform. The air is clear up here for now." Victoria reached out, her fingers catching the rough, frayed sleeve of his coveralls before he could step down the stairs. Her hand was trembling violently, her emerald eyes wide with a rare, desperate vulnerability. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the sirens. "You told me you knew what failure looked like. Don't let them die down there. I can pay for whatever you need. Just don't let this happen." Garrett looked down at her small, pale hand resting on his sleeve. His expression didn't change into one of heroic bravado. It remained perfectly steady, a rock in the middle of a collapsing tide. "Money doesn't change the pressure in a hydraulic line, Victoria," he said softly, using her first name for the very first time without a single hint of hesitation or social deference. "But an intentional hand does. Keep the boy's eyes covered." He pulled his arm away with a smooth, deliberate motion and descended into the strobing white mist of the hangar floor. Victoria watched him go, her breath catching in her throat. He didn't run down the stairs blindly. He moved with a terrifying, calculated precision, skipping every second step, his body naturally leaning away from the falling chemical foam, calculating the vectors of danger with the muscle memory of a man who had navigated active battlefields. When his boots hit the concrete floor, the foam was already up to his knees. The 4 ground handlers were screaming now, the toxic vapor beginning to choke their lungs as they clawed frantically at the steel tracks of the rolling gate. One of them, a veteran line mechanic named Thomas, who had worked at the terminal for 20 years, collapsed to his knees, his hands slipping on the slick epoxy. Garrett didn't waste a single motion on panic. He reached Thomas first, hooking his thick arms under the older man's shoulders and lifting him effortlessly through the heavy white slurry. He dragged him straight toward the secondary fuel truck parked near the wing, a massive 20-ton diesel vehicle that Julian's crew had left idling. "Get inside the cab," Garrett shouted to the other 3 handlers, his voice carrying an immense, authoritative weight that bypassed their panic and forced immediate obedience. "Seal the windows and turn the cabin air filtration to high. Move." The men scrambled up the side steps of the truck, slamming the heavy doors shut just as the overhead foam nozzles opened directly above them with a violent, thunderous roar. Garrett didn't join them. He climbed into the driver's seat of a heavy airport tug, a low-profile, high-torque tractor designed to tow commercial airliners. He didn't look at the ignition keys. His fingers instantly moved beneath the steering column, ripping away a plastic panel to expose the primary starter wires. With a single, sharp twist of his wrist, the massive diesel engine of the tug roared to life, a cloud of black exhaust cutting through the chemical white mist. Up on the gantry, Julian Blake had finally caught up, his face covered in sweat and tears as he looked down at the scene. "He's insane," Julian shrieked, clutching the railing. "He's going to ram the security gate. The impact will trigger the structural sensors in the roof. The whole ceiling will collapse on us." Victoria didn't answer him. She didn't even look at him. Her eyes were locked onto the low-profile tractor below. She could see Garrett's face through the strobing white glare. He wasn't flinching. He wasn't shouting. He was backing the heavy steel nose of the tug directly up to the reinforced track of the rolling gate, aligning the heavy steel hitch with a microscopic point of structural vulnerability where the metal frame met the concrete foundation. He was going to use pure raw torque to shear the deadbolts from the ground up. Through the heavy, chemical-scented smoke, Thomas, the veteran mechanic sitting inside the fuel truck cab, wiped the condensation from the glass window, staring down at Garrett's silhouette. The way the man held the steering wheel, the absolute cold calm in his eyes, the precise angle of the vehicle's alignment, it triggered a memory from 20 years ago, from a highly classified military extraction exercise at a remote defense sector in Nevada. "That's not a line mechanic," Thomas whispered to himself, his breath fogging the glass as his eyes widened in absolute shock. That's the commander." Before he could say the name out loud, Garrett slammed the tractor into low gear, the massive rubber tires screaming against the slick epoxy floor as he dumped the clutch. The massive steel hitch of the airport tug slammed into the reinforcement brace of the jammed track with a deafening metallic explosion that rattled the glass panes of the high executive suites. Sparks cascaded through the thick, milky white foam like a dying firework display. The high-torque diesel engine screamed in a guttural, furious roar, the black exhaust smoke billowing from the stack thick enough to momentarily blind everyone watching from the gantry. The massive rubber tires caught a rare dry patch of concrete beneath the chemical slurry, instantly finding traction. The sheer mechanical violence of the pull tore the heavy anchor bolts straight out of the structural foundation. The reinforced steel gate buckled outward, twisting like a piece of cheap tin before the heavy perimeter welds snapped with the sharp, explosive sound of rifle shots. The path was entirely open. The trapped ground handlers stumbled through the newly created gap, coughing violently as they dragged themselves into the dry, unpolluted air of the adjoining maintenance terminal. Garrett didn't run. He calmly shut down the vibrating engine of the tractor, stepped down from the high iron seat into the ankle-deep chemical foam, and walked toward the escaping crew. His face was smeared with carbon and dark oil, but his stride was as controlled, steady, and unbothered as a soldier walking across a quiet parade ground. Thomas, the veteran handler, collapsed against the concrete wall of the safe corridor, his lungs burning from the toxic vapor. He looked up as Garrett approached, his eyes wide, his chest heaving as he instinctively tried to straighten his spine and raise a hand to salute before his physical strength gave out. "Commander Vance," he rasped, his voice cracked and raw through his gasping breaths. "I knew it was you the moment the engine pitched. Nobody else knows the load limits on those tracks. Nobody else would have held the line for us." Victoria Sterling, still clutching her son Pierce tightly against her chest, hurried down the gantry stairs alongside Daniel Reyes, leaving a completely broken, trembling Julian Blake hovering near the upper railing. She heard the name Thomas had just spoken. It wasn't Stone. It was a name that carried a terrifying, legendary weight she recognized from the absolute highest levels of global defense procurement and aerospace engineering. "Commander Vance?" Victoria repeated, her voice cutting through the fading wail of the facility sirens. She stepped into the damp corridor, her emerald eyes fixed entirely on Garrett's profile. The cold, ruthless billionaire CEO who had entered the hangar that morning was completely gone. In her place stood a mother who had just witnessed a miracle, and a powerful executive who suddenly realized she was standing in the presence of an invisible authority far greater than her own. Garrett stopped walking. He didn't acknowledge the salute, and he didn't accept the title. He simply reached into his deep coverall pocket, pulled out a clean shop rag, and began wiping the dark grease from his hands with a slow, deliberate motion. "Thomas, go see the medical crew at Gate 4, Garrett said quietly, his deep baritone acting as an immediate anchor in the middle of the smoking wreckage. "Get your lungs cleared out. That suppression foam isn't built for breathing." Julian Blake marched down the stairs now, his expensive designer suit ruined, his hair disheveled, but a desperate, ugly malice burning in his wide eyes. He desperately needed someone to blame for the multi-million-dollar destruction of his flagship asset. "This is absolute sabotage," Julian screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched screech as he pointed a trembling finger at Garrett. "He destroyed the facility safety gate. He drove heavy equipment into a structural anchor. Victoria, this man needs to be arrested by airport security immediately. He has ruined our fleet operations and cost us the Vanguard contract. He is a common laborer who just caused a catastrophic facility breach." Daniel Reyes stepped directly between Julian and Garrett, his face a hard, unyielding mask of pure disgust. "Julian, shut your mouth," the chief operating officer said, his voice dropping into a low, threatening rumble. "He just saved your life, and he saved the lives of my ground crew. If he hadn't pulled that track, we would be pulling bodies out of that foam right now because of your forced initialization. I don't care about the logistics of the rescue," Julian bellowed, completely losing his mind under the terrifying pressure of his ruined career. "He is an hourly employee. I am the director of aviation. I hold the authority in this building, and I am firing him effective immediately. Security, remove this man from my deck." The two security guards looked at Julian, then they looked at Victoria, and finally they looked at Garrett, who was now standing perfectly still, watching the display with a quiet, judgmental calm. The guards didn't move a single inch. "You don't have the authority to fire him, Julian," Victoria said. Her voice didn't rise in anger. It dropped into a terrifying crystalline silence that immediately choked the air straight out of Julian's lungs. She took a single step closer to Garrett, her hands steadying her son, who was now staring up at the mechanic with an expression of pure, unadulterated admiration. Julian blinked, his chest heaving as sweat dripped down his nose. "What do you mean I don't have the authority? I run this entire terminal division under your corporate signature. Victoria, he is a nobody." Victoria looked at the faded, scratched plastic badge pinned to Garrett's denim coveralls. Then she looked Julian directly in the eyes. "He isn't a nobody, Julian. He's the man who designed the entire core navigation platform our aircraft fly on. He is the original patent holder of the Obsidian baseline architecture. The global charter empire we built doesn't run under my signature. It runs entirely under his technology." The entire corridor fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Daniel Reyes gasped, his eyes darting to Garrett in absolute paralyzing disbelief. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His knees visibly trembled as the terrifying reality of his own arrogance slammed into him like a physical blow. He had spent months mocking, insulting, and dismissing the very genius whose mind had created the industry they operated in. Garrett threw the dirty shop rag into a nearby waste bin. He finally looked up, his calm, steel blue eyes locking onto Julian's pale face. Your predictive routing model failed because you stripped the manual safety margins to save 2% on fuel efficiency, Julian, Garrett said, his voice carrying the terrifying weight of an absolute commander. I told you the metal doesn't care about your timeline. Now, look at your airframe. Before Julian could find the strength to speak, a sharp, crisp electronic tone chimed from the master security terminal on the wall. The main glass doors of the terminal hissed open, and a group of 4 men in dark, unbranded tactical suits walked into the corridor, led by a high-ranking military liaison wearing silver stars on his collar. The officer didn't look at Victoria. He didn't look at Julian. He walked straight up to Garrett, stopped, and snapped a crisp, flawless military salute. "Commander Vance," the officer said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. The Pentagon tracking grid detected an unauthorized initialization of the Obsidian Protocol at this coordinate. "We have an emergency operational crisis in the North Atlantic corridor, and the Joint Chiefs require your immediate clearance." General Bradley Hayes stood at absolute attention, his eyes locked onto the man in the grease-covered denim. The silver stars on his collar caught the erratic flash of the facility's secondary emergency lights. Behind him, the 4 tactical officers remained entirely motionless, their presence turning the damp, foam-streaked corridor into a high-security military zone. Julian Blake looked like he was about to lose consciousness. He swallowed hard, his voice reduced to a high, raspy stutter. "General, there's been a massive misunderstanding. This man is an hourly line worker. He just destroyed a multi-million-dollar rolling gate. He's not a commander. He's a safety liability." General Hayes didn't even turn his head. He didn't afford Julian a single glance. "Remove this civilian from the deck," the general commanded coldly. Before Julian could utter another defensive scream, 2 of the tactical officers stepped forward. Their movements were seamless and aggressive. They gripped Julian by his arms, lifting his trembling frame off his feet, and forcefully escorted him down the corridor toward the security exit. Julian's protests faded into the distance, a pathetic, echoing whine that finally died out beneath the low hum of the terminal's backup generators. Daniel Reyes slowly stepped back against the wall, his hands raised in silent submission. The chief operating officer knew when a room had completely outgrown his pay grade. He looked at Garrett, not with the dismissive arrogance he had carried an hour ago, but with a profound, paralyzing reverence. Victoria Sterling didn't move. She stood perfectly still, holding Pierce, whose breathing had remained steady only because his small hand was still anchored to the sleeve of Garrett's coveralls. She looked at the military general, then at the man she had assumed was just part of the facility's overhead expenses. "Commander Vance," General Hayes said, stepping closer. 38 minutes ago, a standard commercial transport fleet carrying 300 personnel entered a severe high-altitude atmospheric inversion over the Greenland Sea. The civilian automation software is undergoing the exact pitch axis calibration failure you warned the defense sector about 7 years ago. The predictive models have locked out the ground crews. They are cascading. We need the Obsidian override keys, and we need your hand on the terminal. Garrett didn't rush. He looked down at Pierce, who was staring up at him with wide, trusting eyes. The single father gently reached down, his large thumb wiping a small smear of carbon from the little boy's cheek. He didn't look like a legendary military strategist. He looked like a father whose entire world was contained within the safety of a child. "I stepped away from the defense sector for a reason, General," Garrett said, his voice quiet, carrying a heavy, immovable weight. "My parameters changed 7 years ago. I have a daughter waiting for me at home. My shift ends in 20 minutes. General Hayes' expression tightened, a deep flash of desperation breaking through his rigid military exterior. "Commander, with all due respect, your daughter's safety is anchored to the stability of this airspace. If that transport fleet undergoes structural failure, the entire North Atlantic corridor will lock down. The tracking algorithms are already bleeding into civilian networks. Look at the satellite array." The general snapped his fingers, and one of his tactical officers held up a military-grade rugged tablet. The screen displayed a live global tracking matrix. Hundreds of tiny civilian flight paths were beginning to splinter, flashing a violent, erratic orange. Victoria felt her breath catch in her throat. She looked at the screen, her cold, corporate intellect instantly calculating the global catastrophe unfolding in real time. This wasn't just a business failure anymore. This was a total systemic collapse. She looked at Garrett, her emerald eyes trembling with a deep, rare vulnerability. The powerful, guarded billionaire who feared nothing was entirely exposed. She realized that all her wealth, all her corporate leverage, meant absolutely nothing in the face of raw, unyielding reality. Only the man standing beside her in grease-stained denim held the power to stabilize the world. "Please," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking softly as she stepped closer to him. Her hand gently brushed against his arm, a rare, genuine moment of emotional connection breaking through her guarded exterior. She wasn't asking as a billionaire CEO. She was asking as a mother who had just seen this man bring peace to her terrified child. Help them. If your technology built the foundation of this sky, don't let it fall. Garrett met her gaze. For a silent, heavy second, the sirens, the flashing lights, and the military pressure seemed to fade away completely. He saw the genuine terror in her eyes, the raw humanity beneath the expensive clothes and the icy reputation. He saw a woman who had everything but possessed, no real safety. And Victoria, looking into his steady, unshakable eyes, felt a profound sense of emotional security she hadn't experienced in her entire life. This man didn't need a title to command a room. He didn't need money to provide safety, he just was safety. Garrett exhaled slowly, a quiet, protective gesture that instantly put little Pierce at ease. "Daniel," Garrett called out, his voice instantly reclaiming the invisible authority of the command deck. Daniel straightened up like a lightning bolt had hit him. "Yes, sir?" "Take the boy to the secondary terminal lounge," Garrett ordered calmly. "Ensure the air filtration is locked on internal cycle. Keep him away from the glass." Daniel nodded frantically, gently taking Pierce from Victoria's arms. The boy didn't panic this time. He looked at Garrett, who gave him a reassuring nod. "Remember the number, pilot," Garrett whispered softly. 4. Pierce smiled faintly, his breathing remaining perfectly rhythmic as Daniel carried him down the safe hallway. Garrett turned back to General Hayes, his face hardening into an expression of absolute focus. "Bring up the primary satellite bus on the central briefing room display," Garrett commanded, stepping past the general without waiting for a response. "We're going to have to force a manual voltage drop through the defense grid to blind the civilian software before it tears those airframes apart." General Hayes didn't hesitate. He fell into step behind Garrett, his tactical team immediately moving into a defensive formation around the mechanic. Victoria followed them back into the glass briefing room. The space was completely transformed. The corporate executives had fled, leaving behind a graveyard of expensive tablets and spilled coffee. The main telemetry wall, which had been blank, suddenly erupted into a terrifying maze of military-grade data feeds as Hayes' team patched their field terminals into the mainframe. A sharp, frantic voice cut through the command speakers. "Command, this is Sector 3 Flight Director. The transport fleet has just entered a critical 12-degree pitchdown. The manual columns are frozen. The pilots can't fight the software. We have less than 90 seconds before structural separation begins." Garrett didn't freeze. He walked straight to the center console, his grease-stained hands hovering over the black command line interface. But before his fingers could strike the keys, the primary display flashed a violent, unexpected notification that made General Hayes gasp. "Warning," the automated voice chimed. "Obsidian defensive encryption activated. Master override requires a dual-stage biometric clearance from the original design architect and the primary civilian investor who funded the initial satellite array." General Hayes turned his pale face toward Victoria. "The civilian investor who holds the legacy defense bonds. It's Sterling Global Finance." Victoria's heart stopped. She stared at the flashing biometric scanner on the console. The life of 300 personnel in the Atlantic sky didn't just depend on Garrett's mind anymore. It required her own hand to unlock the weapon she had inherited from her father's estate. But as she stepped forward to press her palm against the glass, the primary telemetry stream let out a sickening, high-pitched scream as the transport fleet's altitude dropped by 10,000 feet in a single second. The scanner pulsed with a sharp, blinding white light. Victoria stepped forward, her hand completely steady as she pressed her bare palm against the cold glass of the terminal. The machine let out a crisp electronic chime, the light instantly turning an emerald green. Sterling clearance confirmed. The automated system droned. Garrett didn't hesitate. He placed his heavy, oil-stained palm on the secondary reader. The console didn't just chime. The entire multi-layered telemetry wall suddenly shifted, stripping away the glossy corporate software and replacing it with a clean black and gold military matrix. Obsidian system fully active. "Welcome back, Commander Vance. Sector 3, tell your lead pilot to completely pull the secondary electrical breaker under his left arm." Garrett commanded into the primary headset, his thick fingers moving across the keys with a terrifying, rhythmic speed. Stop trying to pull up on the control columns. The software is fighting your inputs. Cut the low voltage feed to the automated trim actuators and let the physical cables handle the weight. The audio feed from the Greenland corridor was pure chaos, the deafening sound of rushing wind and screaming metal tearing through the briefing room speakers. "We're pulling the breaker now," the transport pilot yelled through the crackling static. A terrible, breathless 5 seconds ticked by on the master clock. The crimson altitude indicator on the wall dropped to 11,000 feet, 10,000, 9,000. Then it froze. A massive, echoing roar of straining jet engines filled the room, followed by the sudden, crystal-clear voice of the flight captain. "Altitude holding. The pitch axis is responding manually. We have the sky. Commander Vance, we have the sky." The entire command deck erupted into a wave of profound, deafening cheers. The tactical officers let out their breaths, and General Hayes closed his eyes for a single moment, a massive weight lifting from his shoulders. Outside the glass walls, dozens of airport employees, junior mechanics, and corporate managers who had gathered in the hallway began applauding frantically, their faces pressed against the glass. They weren't cheering for a corporate executive or a multi-million-dollar software patch. They were cheering for the man in the faded denim coverall who had just rewritten a catastrophe with nothing but a wrench and his bare mind. General Hayes turned toward Garrett, snapping a rigid, formal salute that was instantly mirrored by every tactical officer in the room. "Thank you, Commander. The defense grid is resetting. We'll handle the logistics from here. Your clearance remains absolute." Through the glass doors, 2 airport security guards were leading Julian Blake out of the facility in heavy metal zip ties for reckless endangerment and safety breaches. His expensive designer suit was torn, his posture completely bent in utter disgrace, as the ground crews he had mistreated for years stood in a double line, watching him pass in absolute silence. Julian caught a glimpse of Garrett through the glass. The realization that he had spent months treating a legendary aviation icon like trash completely crushed what was left of his pride. He dropped his head, his face burning with a public humiliation that would follow him for the rest of his life. The heavy glass doors slid open, and Daniel Reyes stepped back into the room, leading little Pierce by the hand. The moment the boy saw Garrett, he broke away from the chief operating officer and ran straight across the polished epoxy floor, throwing his small arms around Garrett's leg. "You made it stay at 4, Pierce whispered, looking up with absolute adoration. The whole world stopped shaking. Garrett smiled faintly, dropping to one knee to meet the boy's eyes, his large, protective arm wrapping gently around his shoulders. "The whole world is completely safe now, pilot," Garrett said softly, his deep voice carrying that same unyielding warmth that had anchored the room from the start. Victoria Sterling watched them, a tear finally escaping her green eyes and tracking down her cheek. She had spent her entire life building a fortress of wealth, believing that power was something you bought with a corporate signature and a ruthless negotiation. But looking at the quiet masculinity and grounded strength of the man in front of her, she realized she had been entirely blind. Her billions had bought her everything except peace. And this humble father who asked for nothing gave absolute safety without even trying. Garrett stood up, nodding once to Daniel, then looked at Victoria. "The primary network is stable, Victoria. Your fleet can fly safely now. But like I said, my shift is over. I have to go pick up my daughter from her elementary school across town. She doesn't like it when I'm late." Victoria took a slow, deliberate step toward him. The cold, guarded corporate mask was completely gone, replaced by a deep, genuine reverence. "Let me drive you," she said softly, her voice missing all its previous iron, filled instead with a rare, quiet tenderness. "In fact, I want to offer you a new contract. Not a corporate role. A true partnership. You rewrite my fleet's safety protocols on your own terms. Your hours. Your boundaries. Your daughter comes first, every single day. And you never have to hide your brilliance behind a broom again." Garrett looked at her for a long moment, the silent chemistry between them growing naturally through the shared weight of the morning. He saw the real woman behind the billionaire title, and for the first time, he saw a future that didn't require him to stay invisible to keep his family safe. He gave a small, genuine nod, a soft smile, finally breaking through his weathered face. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's go get my daughter." As they walked out of the command deck together, side by side, the entire room fell back to let them pass. The man they had overlooked had just saved their world, and he was walking out into the morning light with the only thing that ever truly mattered: absolute respect.